All right, so we are going to start off actually this unit, not on the first page of your notes, but on the chart that actually starts on the second page of the notes. And that is the chart that talks about the organic molecules. Organic molecules basically make up anything that is alive. So if we take a look at, any of the molecules that are in your body, pretty much all of them are going to be organic, especially the ones that actually make you up. We tend to think of the word organic as meaning something like natural or naturally occurring, and we have to be careful with that because from a chemical perspective, that's not the case. Organic is very specifically molecules that contain both carbon and hydrogen. So you will see in the chemical formula the C and the H. So, for example, we have something like carbon dioxide, CO2, which is something natural. We breathe it out, but that's not an organic molecule because it doesn't have hydrogen. Same thing with water. Water is everywhere. Water is a very important component of our bodies, but it also is not an organic molecule because H2O does not contain any carbon. So we are going to look at the four different classes of organic molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So the first one we're going to look at are the carbohydrates. If we look at the structure of carbohydrates, it contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you will see if we write a formula with that, it will have all three letters in there, C, H, and O. It won't have anything else. It is usually a ring shape, like glucose. Glucose is a ring shape, and we'll take a look at that here in a second. Glucose is that. Complex carbohydrates are polymers of simple sugars, and we'll be talking about what polymers are. Basically, it's a big chain. So we take the simple sugars and we chain them together. The ratio of hydrogen to oxygen is always 2 to 1. And we can see that up here with glucose. I have 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. So basically my number of hydrogens, I just double my number of oxygens. That's a really easy way to tell if I have a carbohydrate or not. One of the things you're going to have to do is understand how to distinguish if you're given a molecule, what kind is it, because it will actually help you answer questions. So if you take a look here, this is the ring structure that we were talking about. At each corner of the ring is a carbon atom. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. This is actually glucose. And if I have just a single ring, I call that a monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide means sugar. And like I said, we can chain them together. So if you make your two little rings there hooked together, so now I have 2 of them, and we call that a disaccharide. And then I can add many, 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 many more of those rings, and I get a polysaccharide. Now, all of these are important for different functions, very specifically, but in general, the carbohydrates function as a structural component of the cell walls, like in plants. But their primary job is fuel for cellular respiration. They help to provide us energy. So let's look at some examples. The monosaccharides, which are our monomers, would include things like glucose, fructose, galactose, and even ribose. Disaccharides would include things like maltose, sucrose, and lactose. And then the polysaccharides, which are our polymers, would be things like starch, cellulose, which makes up the cell wall in plants, chitin. Chitin is part of insect exoskeleton, so you know when you step on a bug and they kind of go crunch, that crunching sound is because the chitin is breaking. Glycogen in animals is actually our stored fuel. So we actually store our ready supply of fuel in our liver in the form of glycogen. So those are our carbohydrates. The second class are our lipids. Lipids contain, again, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But compared to carbohydrates, there's not as much oxygen. You're not going to see that 2 to 1 ratio. So that's one way by looking at the chemical formula. You can tell whether I have a carbohydrate or a lipid. Look at that carbon or that hydrogen to oxygen ratio. These guys are very large. They do not form polymers, and they're made up of one glycerol molecule plus 3 fatty acids. These are the really important, and you'll take a look at this when we look at the cell membrane, because that is one of its main functions. It is the structural component of the cell membrane, the lipid bilayer or the bilipid layer. So we have 2 layers of lipids as part of this. Examples of lipids include things like fats, oils, and waxes. And unlike the others that we're going to be talking about, there is no monomer or polymer form for a lipid. Flipping over to the back side, we're going to take a look at the proteins. Proteins contain nitrogen. This is new. Again, it still has the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen like the other 2, but when you have those 3 plus nitrogen, nitrogen's kind of the giveaway if it's the only other element there that you have a protein. Proteins are made of 20 amino acids, and they can be arranged in different patterns, different orders to create thousands of different proteins. So the amino acids are actually the monomer, and the proteins are the polymers. Sometimes we call these polypeptides, and that's because the bond that joins the amino acids together is called a peptide bond. So when you create a protein, which is a polymer, you have many peptide bonds, so polypeptide. Now, proteins are responsible for a lot of functions in living things, such as enzymes, which we will be learning about, hormones, cell membrane receptors, antibodies, and even structural proteins. So they're very diverse in terms of their functioning within the body. Some examples of some of the polymer forms are things like hemoglobin, which is on your red blood cells that helps to carry oxygen, insulin, which is a hormone that helps control your blood sugar levels, pepsin, which is actually an enzyme in your stomach that breaks down other proteins, and amylase. You can actually tell that this is an enzyme because of the ASE ending. That's very typical. Pepsin's kind of an exception to that, but we'll come back to this with the ASE ending when we talk about enzymes. Now, the monomer form of proteins are, of course, the amino acids. There are 20 of them. So just some examples of these would be things like valine, tryptophan, which you may have heard of from like Thanksgiving, and leucine. And so again, there's 20 of those. I could have listed any of the 20. I just picked 3 of them. The last class of compounds we're going to look at are the nucleic acids. These guys, in terms of their structure, differ from the other 3 in that it's actually made up of what we call a nucleotide. It's a sugar plus a phosphate group plus a nitrogenous base. So if we look at the elements that are involved, it's going to have all of the elements that we've listed so far: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, but now we add phosphorus. So when you see nitrogen plus phosphorus, it's a nucleic acid. If it's just nitrogen, it's a protein. And then if there's neither of those, then you have to look at the oxygen to hydrogen ratio to determine if it's a lipid or if it's a carbohydrate. This exists in a polymer form, so the nucleotide is the monomer form, but when we put it together to actually make a nucleic acid, it is a polymer form. If we take a look at the monomer itself, so you guys have this on your chart, okay, this is the phosphate group, this is the sugar, and that's going to depend on what type of nucleic acid we have, and that is the nitrogenous base. So these 3 components, and you can see they are linked together, so they're actually connected to each other. They actually are, those are the 3 main components that make it up. Now, we're not going to get into all of their structure and anything more detailed than this. But basically, we take these 3 things, they get hooked together, and then we chain a bunch of this grouping together to make our nucleic acid. These guys function in terms of your heredity, so your inheritance in terms of your genetics, and protein synthesis, in other words, making of proteins. The polymer form of nucleic acids includes DNA and RNA, and those are the only 2 examples that ever exist. The monomer form is based on the nucleotide, and they are actually named based on the nitrogenous base. So we have 5 different nucleotides: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. And those should ring a bell because I know you spent a lot of time with those last year. So that kind of summarizes our different organic molecules, and you're going to need to really understand these and know these very, very well. You'll see kind of that level of detail. There's some practice questions that you will be working on a little bit later, after you've had some time to kind of absorb this and go back and reread this. But for now, let's flip to the first page in your handout packet, to this table here. And on this worksheet, we've got this table with the 4 different, sorry, I'm getting my board ready here so I can write on it. All right, I think I can write. So we've got our 4 different macromolecules here. All right, so we need to complete the chart based on what we have just learned. So they've done carbohydrates for us. So it contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The function of the molecule is the main source of energy, and there's also structural things like the cell wall that we talked about. Lipid, mostly carbon and hydrogen. We know there's a little bit of oxygen there. And so in terms of its possible function, okay, we know that this is the cell membrane. Structure. Okay. Nucleic acids contain hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus, and their function is heredity and protein synthesis. The nucleic acids, I'm sorry, not the nucleic acids, the proteins, controls the rate of reactions, like with enzymes, transfer substances into or out of the cell, so that would be our receptors, and fight disease, that would be antibodies. The components of the molecule include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay. So, which of the types of molecules in the table contain carbon? It is actually all of them. Carbohydrate, lipid, nucleic acid, and protein all contain carbon. So this brings us to the end of your notes for this section. There is a carbon video that I want you to watch that's also listed right underneath this note section. So be sure you take a look at that.